Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is a space for reformed thinking, where we get into subjects that might seem straightforward on the surface, but have so much more going on underneath.
And our goal is to give you the full context, to move past the simple definitions and see how these ideas fit into the whole biblical narrative.
Today we are looking at a single Hebrew noun. Just 3 letters. Har.
Right, har. It means mountain or hill. Seems simple enough.
But it's not. I mean, when you think about the story of Scripture, this one word is doing some serious theological work.
Yeah.
It's where the law is given at Sinai. It's the center of hope in Zion.
It's the meeting point. It's the spot on the map where God chooses to intersect with humanity. It's never just geology.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to get into the linguistic side of things, the geography, and of course the theology behind this word har.
We want to trace how this idea of elevation gives structure to biblical faith itself. It defines where covenants are made, where God dwells, and where future hope is directed.
Okay, so let's start with the basics, the anatomy of the word. The sheer frequency of it in the text tells a story all by itself.
It really does. The numbers are pretty striking. Har shows up somewhere between 520 and 558 times in the Old Testament.
Wow.
That tells you something about the world they lived in. This was a culture defined by high ground. It's a masculine primitive noun, just a core part of their vocabulary for describing their physical world.
And it doesn't just mean one thing. Our sources point out 3 main ways the word is used, and sometimes they can overlap a little.
That's where you have to watch the context. The first definition is the obvious one, mountain, a big, high landmass.
And the second?
The second is hill, a smaller, more localized elevation. And the key thing here is that the Bible often doesn't make a sharp distinction between the two. The same word, har, could be a huge peak or a gentle slope.
So that brings us to the third use, which helps a lot with geography. Hill country or mountain range?
That's the one that becomes so useful for mapping things out. When har refers to a whole region, it sets that elevated area in contrast to the flatlands, the valleys or the lowlands.
And that's how they started defining territory.
It's how they drew their maps, in a way. The topography defined who lived where.
You can also see how flexible the word is in its different grammatical forms. It's not just the noun har.
No, it adapts. You have the basic singular har, add the definite article, you get Hor the Mountain. But what I find really interesting is how it shows movement.
Movement being so key in the biblical story.
It is. And to show movement towards a mountain, the text uses a special form, har, to the mountain. It only appears about 13 times.
But when it does, it carries a lot of weight.
A lot. Someone is going up to meet God or fleeing for safety. It's always directional and purposeful.
The sources also point out a really unique variant form, a kind of linguistic fossil.
Yes, this is fascinating. The form is harr. It shows up only once in the entire Old Testament.
We're at it.
In Genesis 14, in the story about the War of the Kings near Sodom, it's what's called a dialect dissimulated form. It just gives us a little window into the history of the language itself, showing that there were subtle regional differences in how people spoke.
So the word was alive, it was changing over time.
It was. And when the writers wanted to be more literary or poetic, they'd use different forms again.
You see that a lot in the Psalms.
For sure. In poetry, you get the plural construct form, harre. It's a more elevated, formal way of saying mountains of. And that leads right into some of the most powerful phrases in the Psalms.
You mean like mountains of God, Haraway?
That's the one. Grammatically, when you attach God's name, all, to a noun like that, it functions as a superlative. It doesn't mean mountains God literally owns.
It means something more like the most majestic mountains imaginable.
Precisely. You see it in Psalm 36. It's painting a picture of a scale and grandeur that reflects God's own might. These are God-sized mountains.
And we know this word wasn't new to Israel. It was part of the regional vocabulary for a long, long time.
Right. It has a deep history in the ancient Near East. You find cognates in other ancient languages.
Like in the Amarna letters.
Yes, the Canaanite word eri appears there. And in Phoenician, you see the exact same spelling as the Hebrew. This tells us that the idea of elevation being a significant marker was common across the whole region.
Okay, so once we understand the word itself, we can see how it gets applied. And this is where har stops being just a word and starts becoming a geographical marker that defines borders and even whole civilizations.
This is where a simple noun starts doing political work. The Bible uses har to draw lines on the map, setting the mountainous zones apart from the flatlands, the plains, the valleys, the lowlands.
And for Israel, these weren't just geographical lines, they were administrative. When you pair har with a name, It defines a territory.
It defines jurisdiction. You get these classic regional names, the Hill-Country of Judah, Har,
Which was the heartland of the southern kingdom.
and then the Hill-Country of Ephraim, Hor Ephraim, which was central for the northern kingdom, and it even applied to non-Israelite areas like the Amorite Hill-Country, harr.
These names aren't just poetic. They're describing a reality on the ground. The mountains offered protection, a different way of life compared to the more exposed lowlands.
A defensible position. And that idea of a whole mountain range acting as one unit becomes very potent in the prophets.
Especially in Ezekiel, right? During the exile.
Yes, look at the phrase Hor the mountains of Israel. It shows up 15 times just in Ezekiel.
He's not talking about one specific peak anymore.
No, he's addressing the entire national landscape as a single entity. It's a prophetic device. It means God's judgment, and also his future restoration isn't just for a city like Jerusalem or Samaria. It's for the whole land, the whole elevated identity of the nation.
And then separate from those big regions, Har is, of course, used for all the famous individual peaks, the ones that are stages for major events.
Mount Hermon, Mount Carmel, Mount Tabor, Gilboa, the Mount of Olives, Nebo. Each one is an anchor for a story.
Carmel is the stage for Elijah's showdown.
Gilboa is where Saul dies. Nebo is where Moses sees the Promised Land. These mountains aren't just scenery, they are active settings in the biblical drama.
Then there's one that's a bit of a puzzle. In the wilderness accounts, we get this name, Hor.
Hor the Mount.
It sounds repetitive, like saying Mount the Mount. What's going on there?
These sources confirm it is a specific individual mountain. The name Hor is actually related to the word har. So the repetition isn't an accident, it's for clarification. It's a way of removing any and all doubt about which mountain is being talked about.
And it's a very specific location. It's mentioned 11 times in the book of Numbers.
Right, and it's most famously the place where Aaron, the high priest, dies.
So when an event has that kind of covenantal weight, the death of the first high priest, the text makes sure the location is absolutely locked down.
It's like saying the peak, that specific mountain peak. There's no ambiguity. The event is tied to an unmistakable spot on the earth.
But maybe the most interesting geographical pairing, the one that is almost a stage set for theology, is Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim.
They are fascinating, Harel and Gerizim. The text always presents them as a pair. It's not just that they're geographically close. The law itself gives them a shared job to do.
You see it laid out in Deuteronomy and then carried out in Joshua. This covenant renewal ceremony has to happen right there, with these two mountains facing each other.
And you have to try and visualize what's described in Joshua chapter 8.
It's an amazing scene.
You have all the tribes of Israel gathered in the natural valley between these two mountains, and they're split into two groups.
Half on the slopes of Gerizim to shout the blessings.
And the other half on the slopes of Ebal to shout the curses. The actual topography of the land becomes the theater for the law. The two mountains separate the people and force them to physically participate in affirming the terms of the covenant.
So the geography itself becomes part of the message. The mountain isn't just a witness, it's an instrument in the covenant ceremony.
It turns a legal agreement into this massive three-dimensional surround sound experience. It's one thing to read a document, it's another to stand between two huge natural landmarks while its terms are shouted across a valley. The high ground defined their relationship with God.
And that idea of high ground and God's law leads us right into the next section, where Har stops being about geography and becomes almost pure theology.
Right, the two central holy mountains of Israel's faith.
Because lots of mountains are mentioned, but the sources identify two as being absolutely central to Israel's worship and experience of God's presence.
And these two really define the whole story, from beginning to, well, not to end, but to its long-term home.
Let's start at the beginning then. The mountain where the nation was formed, Sinai, also called Horeb.
The sources are clear on this. Mount Horeb, Hardrub, is also known as Mount Sinai, Har Sinai. They are two names for the same sacred mountain in the wilderness.
And the titles this mountain gets are just incredible. They set it apart from every other place on earth.
The titles tell you its function. First, it's the mountain of God, Har Hoshim. You see that in Exodus 3 and again in 1 Kings 19.
The idea that God's presence was so concentrated there that the mountain itself took on his name.
It became consecrated by his presence. It was God's temporary address, you might say.
It's also called by God's covenant name.
Yes, Mount Yahweh, Har Hu. That title is used in Numbers 10, right as the Ark of the Covenant is leaving the mountain. It marks it as a place belonging wholly to the covenant Lord of Israel.
What's also interesting is how Once you're in that part of the story, the text doesn't even need to use the full name.
That's right. The context is so clear that just the definite article is enough. The mountain, hāhār. In Exodus and Deuteronomy, when it says they went up the mountain, everyone knows which one it is. There is no other.
So its main role is the place of the law, the Ten Commandments, the establishment of the covenant. It's the birthplace of the nation of Israel.
It's their founding document, written in stone on that spot. But the key is that the Sinai encounter was temporary. God gave the law there, but he didn't set up his permanent home there.
Which brings us to the second, and in a way, the permanent holy mountain, Mount of Zion, Jerusalem.
And that contrast is so important. Sinai was the mountain of the initial meeting, the giving of the law. Zion is the chosen place for God's established permanent dwelling and his rule.
You can see that shift in just how often it's mentioned. The name Zion, Ion, shows up 154 times in the Old Testament.
It dominates the Psalms and Isaiah, and the specific phrase Mount Zion, Harion, appears 20 times. It becomes the theological shorthand for the city of God.
And his origins were actually pretty humble, geographically speaking.
Very humble. It started as the fortress Zion, made at Aon, which was a Jebusite stronghold on the eastern hill of Jerusalem. It became the city of David only after he conquered it.
So the whole theological weight of the place comes later. It's about God's choice, not the mountain's natural features.
It's all about divine election. Zion isn't special because it's the tallest mountain. It's not even close. It's special because God chose it. Psalm 132 is clear. God desired Zion for his dwelling place. That choice changes everything.
And that divine choice results in a whole new set of titles for the mountain, all connected to the temple that would be built there.
The titles explain its new job. It's called God's Holy Mountain, Har. You see that in Psalm 2, in Isaiah, in Ezekiel. It's the mount of the house of Yahweh, Har Bet-yu, tying it directly to the temple building, or sometimes just the temple hill, Har Habayit.
But the language used to describe Zion goes way beyond just the physical temple. The sources show it gets elevated to this cosmic, symbolic status.
This is where the theology gets really grand. Zion is described as the quintessence of beauty and the center of the world. Passages in Psalms 48 and 50 are not just local praise songs. They are making a cosmic claim.
They connect Zion to the idea of a world mountain,
which was a common idea in the ancient Near East. The sources point out the conceptual link to the peak of Zaphon, which was the mythical mountain home of the Canaanite god Baal.
So the biblical writers are engaging in a bit of polemics here.
A huge bit. By using that kind of language for Zion, they are making a direct challenge. They're saying, your God's mountain is a myth. Our God's mountain, Zion, is the true cosmic center. This is the real source of order and life.
And there's an even bigger claim in the sources, the idea that the creation of Zion is linked to the creation of the world itself.
This is a massive theological step. It suggests that Zion wasn't just a historical choice, but was part of the original design of creation. If Zion was made with the world, it shares in the world's God-given stability.
Which is why Psalm 125 can say that Mount Zion cannot be moved.
Its stability is tied to the stability of creation itself. Zion becomes the physical point on earth that represents God's intention for order and good government for the whole world.
So Zion isn't just the place you go to worship. It's the source from which all good things flow out to the people.
That's the outcome of its status. From Zion comes help and aid. From Zion flows blessing. From Zion goes out instruction, the Torah and righteousness. It's the spiritual and governmental capital of God's kingdom on earth.
So we have these two poles. Sinai, the mountain of law and temporary presence, and Zion, the mountain of permanent rule and cosmic blessing. But the very fact that these holy mountains exist creates a conflict, doesn't it?
It does, because the idea of elevation, of high ground, was used by Israel for the exact opposite of authorized worship all the time.
And that takes us to our fourth section, Har in conflict, cult, and prophecy.
You can't understand the historical books without understanding this tension. The mountain gets you closer to the transcendent, but what you do when you get there, that's the question.
So for every divinely authorized holy mountain, there were countless unauthorized ones.
Yes, the high mountains and hills, Hiharim Haramim, were constantly being used for illicit worship. These were the high places, the Bamot.
Why were they such a persistent problem?
A few reasons. One was just convenience. It was a lot easier to go to a local hilltop shrine than to make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, especially for people in the northern kingdom. But the bigger issue was syncretism.
Mixing worship of Yahweh with Canaanite practices.
That's it. You end up with unauthorized priests, unauthorized sacred objects like Asherah poles, and unauthorized sacrifices. It creates this direct opposition between the elevation of covenant at Zion and the elevation of rebellion on a local hill. The prophets rail against it constantly.
The books of Kings are basically a record of this struggle.
Yeah.
You have good kings who tear down the high places and bad kings who build them or let them stand.
It became the great test of a king's faithfulness. Were they committed to the centralized, pure worship at Zion as the law commanded? Or did they allow this decentralized, corrupted worship to continue? The choice of which hierarch to worship on was a declaration of whose authority you were under, God's or your own.
And beyond this religious conflict, Harran also gets used as a symbol for political entities. Mountains stand for strength, for pride, for empires.
A mountain is a symbol of stability and power. So, in the prophets, mountains often become the targets of divine judgment. It's a way of saying that God can bring down even the most powerful human kingdoms.
Like when Babylon is called the Mountain of the Destroyer. Har HaMashet.
Babylon seemed like an immovable object. It had crushed Jerusalem. By calling it a mountain, the prophet acknowledges its apparent strength, but by calling for its destruction, he's saying that God can and will level any earthly power that sets itself up against him.
There's that one amazing story in 1 Kings where this theology of terrain gets challenged directly by Israel's enemies.
Oh, the Syrians. It's a great story. During a conflict with King Ahab, the Syrian army gets defeated up in the hills, so their commanders come to a conclusion.
They decide that Israel's God must be God of the mountains, El Sheharnim.
But not a god of the plains, El Shamarkim. They figured his authority was limited by geography. If they could just fight Israel on flat ground, they'd win.
A huge theological mistake.
A fatal one. The text makes it very clear what happens next. The battle moves to the plains, and Yahweh gives Israel an even bigger victory there. The point is made. His rule isn't limited to the high ground. The mountain might be his chosen place for revelation, but his sovereignty is total over every valley and plain.
The prophets also use har in some very specific critiques. There's that disputed passage in Amos 6.
Right. Amos speaks against those who are confident on Zion and carefree on Mount Samaria. He's targeting the two capital cities of the two kingdoms, both built on hills.
And their sense of security came from their geography. They thought their fortified high ground made them untouchable.
And the sources lay out a couple of ways to understand this verse. One view is that Amos was mainly talking about Samaria, the northern capital, and the reference to Zion was added later by an editor applying the prophecy to Judah.
What's the other view?
A less likely one is that the name Zion had become a kind of generic, poetic term for any capital city on a mountain.
But either way, the prophetic point is the same.
The point is the same. He's condemning anyone who trusts in their physical elevation, their military high ground, instead of in God. The very mountain that should have been a site of reverence had become a symbol of their false security.
But all this conflict over the use of mountains is, in the prophetic view, temporary. The story is heading toward a future where Zion's status is undisputed. Har is absolutely central to their hope.
It is. The prophets consistently anchor their vision for the future on Mount Zion. Especially after the exile, the hope is for a glorious restoration centered there.
And this hope has a few key parts. The exiles will return to Zion.
Yahweh's kingly rule will resume from Zion. And, maybe most striking, the other nations of the world will come to Zion. Not as conquerors, but as students.
That's the vision in Micah 4, isn't it? Come, let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, that he may teach us his ways.
It's an incredible reversal. The law that was given on Sinai to one nation now goes out from Zion to all nations. Instruction, Torah, flows from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth.
The mountain stops being just a local holy place and becomes the spiritual center for the entire world. The high ground becomes the meeting point for all of humanity.
It's the picture of God's final design. A real, physical, elevated place where his rule is established and recognized by all. A perfect and permanent Zion.
So if we bring all this together, this one little word, har, which appears over 500 times, is doing so much. It's not just a hill.
Not at all. It ranges from being a simple term for the landscape to being the specific sacred location for the giving of the law at Sinai, and then for God's permanent dwelling and rule at Zion.
It's the geographical pin in the map for Israel's entire story, rooting their history and their hope in real elevated places.
That elevation always signals a proximity to God, a place of significance.
And that brings us to a final thought for you to consider. The mountain is the place of God's most glorious presence, for law and for blessing. But it's also the most common place for human rebellion, for the illicit cults on the high places.
That tension runs through the whole biblical story. The choice is always between obedience going up to Zion as commanded and rebellion building your own altar on any hill you choose. The physical choice of which harr you stand on becomes a spiritual statement.
Elevation brings you closer to the divine. And because of that, the consequences of faithfulness or of corruption are that much greater.
So as you read other stories in Scripture that happen on high ground, think about Abraham on Mount Moriah or the Transfiguration, you can use this framework. Ask yourself, is this mountain a confirmation of God's covenant, or is it a site of human failure or testing? The context of that elevated ground will tell you almost everything you need to know.